Welcome to Only for Your Ears and today's episode 32, The Snail and the Rosebush, written by Hans Christian Andersen, which I've renamed as The Cautious Snail Prevails and the Prickly Rosebush Thrives. The structure will remain the same, starting with the highlighted sentences where I'll digress, and then there'll be a brief reflection. Next will be my critical review on how this fairy tale plays in today's society, with some examples from either films or some real life people and situations, famous people probably. And last but not least, the trigger points. Now, the trigger points can be good or I would say a little negative. It depends. But I hope that this one's going to be more positive than negative. And then we'll close. So let's begin with the summary of the snail and the rosebush, or as I call it, the cautious snail prevails and the prickly rosebush thrives. Written by Hans Christian Andersen, is a fairy tale that revolves around a conversation between a snail and a rosebush in a garden. I digress. I wonder what a snail with a protective shell and a beautiful rose with sharp, thorny stems have in common. The garden is surrounded by a hedge of hazelnut bushes and is home to cows and sheep. The snail, carrying itself with its shell, believes it will achieve more than the rosebush, which blooms roses and the other creatures in the garden. I digress. The protective instincts of the snail feels safe from the dangers of its surroundings, whereas the rose is a permanent part of the environment it lives. The rosebush patiently asks the snail when it will fulfill its potential. I digress. In life, there is no real set time as to when one will achieve their potential, especially a snail. But the snail remains elusive, taking its time and criticizing the rosebush for not making any progress. I digress. The rose is a plant and is used to bring color, visual joy, and appreciations to home. The snail is slow in movement and progress because that's its nature, but is also considered a delicacy in some cuisines. As the seasons change, the rosebush continues to bloom and the snail remains unproductive. So it seems, eventually retreating into its shell and rejecting the world. I digress. I can see why the snail is retreating after seeing the seasonal growth of the rose in all its glory. Seeing is believing. The snail's slow, invisible progress isn't quantitatively, it's more quality driven. That is recognized over a period of time. The rosebush reflects on the joy it has brought to others through its roses and memories it cherishes of those experiences. I digress because its beauty and appreciation are evident in the eyes of the world as an equal exchange of products, services, and money. Despite these accomplishments, the rosebush cannot escape the fate of turning to earth. I digress. This is demonstrating the cyclical presence of nature's process. Years pass, and both snail and rosebush eventually become part of the earth. New rosebushes and snails emerge, with the snails continuing to dismiss the world, emphasizing the cyclical nature of life. I digress. This story highlights the contrast between the rosebush, which selflessly offers its beauty to the world, and the snail, which withdraws from it. I digress. This is really taking a look at the introvert and the extrovert personality. The tale encourages readers to appreciate the unique gifts each individual has to offer and use those gifts for the betterment of the world. I digress. Maybe the extroverts give birth to their ideas faster than the introverts, who are slow to come out of the closet and show the world what they have. And sometimes introverts suffer from perfectionism and criticism. This can make an introvert slow to reveal their ideas too. There's a large price to pay for being different and unique, and not everybody has the courage to stand in their power. And not everybody, whether they're an extrovert or an introvert, has the ability to pay the price of what it really means to be different. And you do pay a price. My critical review on how this fairy tale plays in today's society, which is quite interesting. This fairy tale touched the proverbial nerve that we've all experienced. I believed Hans Christian Andersen was ahead of his time. I see him as an observer of society's system through the written word filled with wisdom, which stems from his rich and colorful life he had, even though he was poor. Yes, it's true. You can have a rich and colorful life even though you're poor. I think I look at this review from the perspective of encouragement. As you're aware of, I come from a toxic family with a lot of criticism, jealousy, with a narcissistic mother who was always competing with me. She would continuously drone on about how I stand out. This made me feel conscious and very anxious, as though I was deliberately begging for attention, which wasn't true. Even though being raised by a narcissist, you don't get to have much attention at all. So maybe that could have been it. I now realize it was my natural glow about me. It was my natural internal and external glow I had. I have about me that was attracted people to me, and that's why they noticed me. One day, my ballet teacher threw me out of class, shouting, "All you want is attention. Get out." I was sure it was something I had done wrong, but I wasn't aware of it. Then I got a revelation one day from the same ballet teacher who had spotted me in Covent Garden from a distance. He mentioned he had seen me in my apricot colored jumper in Covent Garden. He quietly smiled and walked away. That natural something I had kept chasing me around until I finally made peace with it. I tried so hard to dim my light. I became a hermit for a little over 21 years living in Barcelona. I was certain that I was doing something wrong, so I tried to correct myself based on the criticism that had been projected onto me by other people. I was convinced that since the critics could see me, that they were speaking the truth. Growing up, I had a natural tendency of sharing little creative ideas that came to mind, just so I could help people with developing ideas or add to society. But this was met with competitiveness, snide remarks, cunning behavior, and we don't want your ideas, followed by secretly using my ideas and presenting them as their own while turning their nose up at me. So I started to turn inward and I became reluctant to share whatever gifts I may have had. Encouragement is an uplifting act that is meant for to support and inspire someone despite your personal experience or prejudices. What I noticed about the rosebush is it was supported by the obvious joy it brought to people's lives because of their beauty, visual presence, and love. It's these gestures of gratitude during the rosebush's cyclical growth that I believe breathes joy into the heart of the rosebush, which allows the flower to spread its petals of extrovertis like a happy peacock. The rosebush knows it's appreciated. The power of the snail's introvertis is, is that they can control the process of when and how to develop their gifts in spite of their reluctance to openly share them. Sometimes introverts carefully select the right time to present their ideas. There have been cases in history when inventions weren't ready for the public to absorb and the idea fell flat, only to finally be picked up by someone else at a better time. For example, Steve Jobs wasn't an introvert, he was an extrovert. But after he was fired from his own company, he was forced into a time of creative seclusion. May I add, just like the snail, Steve Jobs wanted to run away from Silicon Valley because he was considered a public failure. So, what did he do? He went inside, just like the snail, the introvert, and freed himself with all his glorious creativity because he wasn't under pressure from the general public. Here's a quote from the worst, most reclusive, but creative period of his life. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could ever have happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life, being inside and free. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next. I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lauren and I have a wonderful family together. So the snail may be slow to develop his or hers gifts and share them with the world. But I like to believe that once the introvert shows what they have been weaving out of plain sight, the public will appreciate the introvert's talents too. Let me bring into focus the introverts for a moment. Wisdom and insights. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are two famous introverts. Believe it or not, it's hard to believe that. I can see it in Hillary Clinton, even though she glows with the glow of an extrovert. And Barack Obama, I can see the introvert in him. Famous introverts who brought the most dynamic presidential primaries in US history. people didn't want this campaign to stop. They tried to lengthen it out for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was already in August when they finally got the enough votes for him to be nominated. It was that dynamic. So I think introverts have an extroverted interior roaming around inside of them, the same way that an extrovert has an introvert interior roaming around inside. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, philanthropist and world's richest person, was once asked how to succeed in a predominantly extroverted world. And this is what he said. Let me find it. Well, I think introverts can do quite well. If you're clever, you can learn to get the benefits of being an introvert, which might be, say, being willing to go off for a few days and think about a tough problem, read everything. You can push yourself very hard to think out on the edge of that area, which we call now thinking outside of the box. Then, if you come up with something, if you want to hire people, get them excited, build a company around that idea, you better learn what extroverts do. You better hire some extroverts like Steve Ballmer, I would claim as an extrovert, and tap into, reach into both sets of skills in order to have a company that thrives both in deep thinking and building teams and going out into the world to sell these ideas. This is some very, very good advice because I am an introvert and I would, if I could, like to do something like this. One never knows, does one? Let's take a look at Rosa Parks, a quiet, unassuming Black woman who changed the face of the civil rights movements when she refused to stand up and sat down on a bus in the South. Rosa Parks became one of the most historically important figures in 1955 after refusing to give her seat up for a white man. Imagine that. In the introduction of her book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, Susan Cain states, I had always imagined Rosa Parks as a stately woman with a bold temperament, someone who could easily stand up to a busload of glowing passengers. But she died in 2005 at the age of 92. The flood of obituaries record her as a soft-spoken, sweet, and small in stature. They said she was timid and shy, but had the courage of a lion. They were full of phrases like radical humility and quiet fortitude. Let's move on to the extrovert, which I will call visionary projection. Martin Luther King Jr. did their extrovertist change history. Well, I think he did. Martin Luther King Jr., an iconic figure in the American civil rights movement, was born on January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. His father was a Baptist minister and his mother was a school teacher. Both instilled in him a strong sense of self-worth and faith. King's childhood was steeped in African American Baptist church community, shaping his worldviews and sowing the seeds of his future activism. Devoted to his studies, King graduated from Morehouse College in 1948 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology, later earning a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozer Theology Seminary in 1951 and a PhD in systematic theology from Boston University in 1955. King's leadership in the civil rights movement commenced with his involvement in Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger. As president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, King utilized the principles of nonviolent protest inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy. And I think Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy came from, I think, one of the first presidents of the United States. His stirring speeches and peaceful protests brought national attention to the movement. During this period, King planned his famous letter from Birmingham jail, a poignant defense of nonviolent resistance to racism. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous moment came during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August 1963. Here he delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. And that I Have a Dream speech, he really wasn't talking about his dream. He was talking about the collective stream of dreams of people that attended that particular march. He wasn't talking about his dream. He had maybe another vision, but the collective had this vision, and he reflected that, calling for an end to racism, envisioning a future where people would be judged by their character, not their skin color. King's relentless pursuit of equality earned him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and on April 4, 1968, King's life was tragically cut short when he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. His legacy continues to inspire and influence social justice and movements globally. And I must say, I had the pleasure, I did not know this until I did not know this, but I was in presence for a couple of months with Velma Hill. Velma and Norma Hill took up the mantle of Martin Luther King's equality for work, on an influence of social justice, and talking about jobs and equality. They took up that mantle, and I must say, I was very, very blessed to have come across Velma Hill, an incredible, credible woman who was in the civil rights movement when she was only 21 years old. I believe that Martin Luther King speeches and vision reached out to people, and that was the extrovert side of him. But I believe the introvert side of him was that quiet internal reverence and the philosophy behind his movement and what he represented was more introverted. Next, we're going to talk about someone who there's no way you could say it. He was a committed extrovert, and that is the great Muhammad Ali, who died in 2018. after a very long, debilitating illness. This is what Muhammad Ali said: "I'm not the greatest, I'm the double greatest." Okay, declared Muhammad Ali, a gold medal winning Olympian and the most celebrated boxer of all time. He was an energetic and performative athlete, but Ali's energy wasn't justified in the ring. He was also an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War. After refusing to serve in the military in 1967, Ali was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, a decision the US Supreme Court overturned in 1971. Now, here was a man that was also quite very revolutionary, and he also understood, like many people, about the civil rights movement. In actual fact, he had a lot of friends and a lot of white friends from Kentucky. And one of his biggest friends was Billy Crystal, a white Jewish man who honored him at his memorial. And they were very, very good friends. So I'd like to mention about his brilliance as a person and as a boxer in the documentary film When We Were Kings. It's about Muhammad Ali's, I think it was one of his last fights that was going to take place in Zaire. It actually put Zaire, the country, on the map because they were going to have this fight. And his opponent was George Foreman. It was more like George Foreman's fight, and it was Muhammad Ali was the opponent, and it was George Foreman's fight to lose. Now, if anybody knows anything about George Foreman when he was in his heyday, he would be in a ring for 3 minutes and he would knock his opponent out and immediately win that fight. And I think it was Muhammad Ali's manager said to him, "Look, I know you want to have this fight and to prove that you can do it," because Muhammad Ali, in theory, was not really a heavyweight. He was more a middleweight. He wasn't that big, actually. And George Foreman was like a big slab of concrete. Well, what he did, he had a plan. He had an inside game and an outside game. So he went to Zaire with George Foreman, and he presented himself to the photographers and everybody, and he had a plan. He said, "Look, if I win this fight, I will open up a school and a hospital in Zaire." He had a vision of what he was going to do with the money, whereas George Foreman did not have a vision. All George Foreman wanted to do was get on the plane with his dog, train, and knock out Muhammad Ali in round 3 in 3 minutes. And it didn't quite work out that way. Muhammad Ali knew that he could not beat George Foreman physically, but he was going to beat him mentally. And that's exactly what he did. It was a surprise to everybody. After round 3, people were in shock that the fight was still going on. Muhammad Ali hung on the rails and just made himself like a sandman. And every time George Foreman punched him, it didn't penetrate his body. Well, now we get up to round 13. And to his surprise, George Foreman's surprise, Muhammad Ali has exhausted George Foreman mentally, that by the time Muhammad Ali gives him 2 or 3 punches, he falls down on the ground. The umpire counts to 10, and Muhammad Ali wins the fight. And it was very, very smart play by Muhammad Ali. It was a brilliant strategy. He knew when he said to his manager, "Don't worry about me, I'm going to dance. I'm really going to dance." He meant it because he had a strategy and he knew that George Foreman did not have a strategy. And unfortunately, what it showed was that George Foreman didn't really have much character back then in the day. But today, Muhammad Ali's daughter is using the techniques of George Foreman. They have an actual George Foreman style of boxing, which he developed when he went through the 2 years of depression after he was horribly beaten by Muhammad Ali. So I think George Foreman was this big man that was very much an introvert, and his opponent was a massive introvert, extroverted personality, may I say, with a small body. So it was very interesting. Size isn't everything. Let's continue. So those are my two, I think, three examples now. I want to talk about the trigger points and what really triggered me. Well, the first thing that came to mind is my own personality, trying to deal with an introverted person that has that has a vision. I I want to be seen, but I don't want to be seen. A bit like playing peekaboo. And in order for me to really do what I think I want to do, or what I really know I want to do, I'm really going to have to do a little bit what Bill Gates did. And that is hire an extroverted person to project my ideas forward, or I have to dig deep inside of me and pull out the extrovert and do it myself. As an an introverted person, people have tried to label me as loud and hateful extrovert. But this isn't true. This is not true, people. I'm not a loud and hateful extrovert. This has to be, this has to do with projectionism. Also, jealous haters using me as a garbage container to throw their crap in, and how I'm fighting that back. Well, how I'm fighting it is that people are really beginning to see the real character. It's coming through, it's shining through. And one of the reasons why it's shining through is because I do not pay attention anymore, or what people have to say as much. And I'm not seeking people's approval all the time. So I am going to have to decide on whether I want to be seen. I do want to be seen. I was a performer for a very long time. I was a dancer. And there was this introverted person there, but some of the best performers in the world are the most introverted. Dare I mention Michael Jackson, and also I think Prince too is an introvert. Let's talk about Robert Mincham, a very underestimated person, an American actor who spent his early years in prison. He was blessed with many gifts. He was definitely introverted. And he dated Shirley MacLaine, who's still alive. And she said he was the most gifted person and the most talented artist she'd ever met. And he was so humble, and so he underestimated himself so much. He was very introverted and protected. In actual fact, when I first came to Barcelona, I wanted to go and get some calypso music. because I had to do a little presentation. And I went into this shop and I asked for some calypso music, and they said yes. Do you want it from by Harry Belafonte, who's a black man and an actor from Jamaica, or would you like it from Robert Mitchum? I said, Robert Mitchum? He said, oh, yes, he is a fine, fine calypso artist. Well, I listened to him sing and I was devastated. He sounded just like a black man, and he sounded even better than Harry Belafonte. I couldn't believe it. He was also in the civil rights movement. He never thought much of his talents, and because he never thought much of his talents, he never brought them out into the sunlight for everybody to see. He quietly shared them by singing in a studio and having his voice recorded. The last person I'd like to talk about, she's also an introvert with a quiet introvert with a bold vision on social issues. And that was Dame Eleanor Roosevelt, who was considered a huge empath, very compassionate, was very helpful in the First World War amongst soldiers that had been horribly and fatally wounded. And she visited them all the time. She showed tremendous compassion. And there was a time when an opera singer, a black opera singer, was to sing at the White House, and she was refused to sing inside the White House. So what she did was she moved the festivities to the Lincoln Memorial. It was huge. And I mean, of course, about 200 people were supposed to come inside this White House, which is very tiny. And when she moved it, as she had it outside, thousands upon thousands of people came to listen to this incredible black opera singer. So she was quite revolutionary, and she was very, very instrumental in trying to bring about in some kind of integration amongst the races in the military. She wasn't completely successful, but she tried. So here was a bold mover and shaker who had extroverted actions, but was a quiet introvert. Well, we've finished this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd like to say thank you very much for the people that view and listen and come back week after week. I really appreciate your presence and your love and your involvement. Thank you very much. And I'm going to leave with my phrase or my expression. And that is healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give each other, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Please remember to share and like, give me a thumbs up, and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. So until next week, goodbye.